In 1835, a doctor finally proved that undercooked pork could plant parasites in your muscle tissue that stay there for decades. The Torah banned pork 3,300 years before that discovery. The Quran banned it 1,200 years before. No microscopes, no germ theory, no idea bacteria even existed. So how did they know? Strip away the religion, and almost every ancient food law on Earth lines up with a disease we wouldn't identify for another 2,000 or 3,000 years. That's either the biggest coincidence in human history, or it isn't a coincidence at all. And new research keeps finding the same thing. Those rules were quietly doing the job of a public health department centuries before anyone knew what a pathogen was. We were taught to call these taboos, superstition, old world rules with no real logic behind them. But take the theology out of it, and what's left looks less like faith and more like applied epidemiology. Introduction: the forbidden food paradox. Every culture on Earth has rules about food. Not preferences, rules. Hard lines you don't cross. And if you look at them individually, they seem random. No pork, no shellfish, no mixing milk and meat, no eating after noon, no beef ever under any circumstance. For a long time, the explanation was simple. These were religious quirks, arbitrary, symbolic at best. But starting in the 20th century, a strange pattern started showing up in medical journals. Researchers studying foodborne illness kept finding that the exact foods banned by ancient law were the exact foods most likely to carry the diseases that would have been invisible, untraceable, and devastating to a pre-modern community. This is the story of what happens when you read religious law as if it were a public health record door. Chapter 1: Kosher Law and the Parasite No One Could See. Starting with the most famous example, the kosher ban on pork, found in Leviticus, roughly 1400-1200 BCE. And heart, for centuries, the explanation was theological. Pigs were simply declared unclean. But here's what we know now, that they couldn't have known then. Pork, especially undercooked or poorly stored pork, is one of the most common historical vectors for Trichinella spiralis, a parasitic roundworm that causes trichinosis. The parasite forms cysts directly in human muscle tissue. And in the pre-modern world, with no refrigeration and inconsistent cooking temperatures, infection rates from pork were significantly higher than from other livestock. Layer onto that the practical reality of pig farming in the ancient Near East. Pigs don't thrive on arid grazing land the way sheep do. And goats do. They compete with humans for grain and water in a region that had little of either, and they're far more likely to carry disease. In dense, poorly sanitized settlements, a ban on pork wasn't just about hygiene. It removed an animal that was expensive to keep. The same logic shows up in the kosher rule against eating blood, and the requirement to fully drain it during slaughter. A process called shashita. Blood is one of the fastest growing mediums for bacteria at room temperature. Draining it quickly after death measurably reduces bacterial load before the meat is even prepared. And the rule against mixing milk and meat? Modern food science gives us a clean explanation. Meat and dairy decompose differently, and dairy residue on meat handling surfaces creates an ideal environment for bacterial cross-contamination, particularly in a hot climate with no refrigeration. Meal preparation surfaces were reused constantly. These laws were framed as medicine. They were framed as covenant, as holiness, as identity. but the survival math lines up. Chapter 2. Halal, the Desert, and the Logic of Fermentation. Islamic dietary law, codified from the 7th century onward, shares the pork prohibition with Judaism, and the underlying risk profile is largely the same. But halal law adds 2 more restrictions worth examining closely: the ban on alcohol, and the specific method of slaughter known as dabiha. The alcohol prohibition is usually framed purely as a moral and spiritual rule, and that framing isn't wrong. But there's a practical layer underneath it. In the Arabian Peninsula's climate, controlling fermentation without modern tools is difficult. Improperly fermented or contaminated alcoholic beverages were a meaningful source of illness in pre-modern societies. And a society-wide prohibition removes that risk entirely rather than relying on inconsistent brewing practices. Dabiha slaughter, a swift cut to the throat, followed by complete draining of blood, while the animal's heart continues to pump, produces meat with dramatically lower residual blood content than other slaughter methods. Lower blood content means lower to bacterial growth medium, which in a hot desert climate, before refrigeration, is the difference between meat that lasts and meat that spoils within hours. There's also a structural pattern worth noting. Halal law requires the animal to be healthy and uninjured at the time of slaughter. That single rule filters out animals that were already sick, removing a major vector for disease transmission before the meat ever reaches a person's plate.
Hi listeners! Where are you watching from? Leave it on the comment section.
Chapter 3. Sacred Cows and the Economics of Survival. In India, the protection of cattle is one of the most misunderstood dietary rules in the world. Outsiders often read it as pure superstition. But economist and anthropologist Marvin Harris, in a widely cited 1966 analysis, argued that cow protection was a brilliant piece of ecological accounting. A live cow in an agrarian economy produces milk, pulls plows, and produces dung used as both fertilizer and fuel. For years, a dead cow produces one meal. In a fragile agricultural system where famine was a recurring threat, eating your draft animals during a bad harvest would guarantee an even worse harvest the following year. Religious prohibition removed the temptation entirely, even during desperate times. Which is exactly when short-term thinking is most dangerous to a community's long-term survival. Ayurvedic medical texts, developed alongside this cultural framework, add a second layer: detailed food combining rules, including a famous prohibition against consuming milk and meat together, almost identical in function to the kosher rule. Limiting bacterial cross-contamination in a hot climate. Whether the original reasoning was spiritual, economic, or medical, likely doesn't have a single clean answer. And that's a point we'll come back to later in this video. But the outcome of the rule, regardless of its stated reasoning, was a more resilient food system. Chapter 4. Confucianism in China: Heat, Order, and Food Safety as Philosophy. Chinese food culture, shaped heavily by Confucianism and later Taoist principles, didn't rely on outright bans the way Abrahamic traditions did. Instead, it built an entire philosophy around how food should be prepared, and that philosophy turns out to map onto food safety almost perfectly. The deep cultural preference for thoroughly cooked food, hot soups, and boiled water has a name in public health circles. It dramatically reduces exposure to waterborne and foodborne pathogens in regions where water sources were inconsistently clean. Raw food, especially raw water, was treated with cultural suspicion for centuries, long before boil your water became standard medical advice. Seasonal eating, eating produce only when it was naturally in season, tied to the 5 elements framework, wasn't just philosophical balance. It meant food was eaten at peak freshness, before storage-related spoilage became a risk, and it forced dietary variety across the year instead of over-reliance on any single nutrient source. Even chopstick culture and communal serving customs, using separate serving utensils from eating utensils, reduced the spread of saliva-borne pathogens between diners centuries before double dipping entered the public health vocabulary in the West. Chapter 5: Medieval Europe's Fasting Calendar as Ecological Regulation. By the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had built an entire calendar around food restriction: Lent, Fridays, vigils before holy days, collectively removing meat from the table for roughly a third of the year. The religious framing was penance and discipline. The ecological effect was something closer to a livestock management system. Removing meat consumption for extended, predictable periods gave herds time to recover their numbers, reduced pressure on grazing land during specific seasons, and pushed protein consumption toward fish, which, unlike cattle, can repopulate faster and didn't compete with humans for arable farmland. It also had a public health side effect historians have pointed to more recently. Red meat overconsumption is now linked to a range of modern, chronic diseases. A medieval diet that mandated roughly 4 months a year without meat, replaced largely by fish, legumes, and grain, by total coincidence or not, remarkably close to dietary patterns modern nutrition science associates with lower cardiovascular risk. Chapter 6: Pacific Kapu, the world's oldest fishery management system. Travel to pre-contact Hawaii, and you find one of the most sophisticated resource management systems in the ancient world: the Kapu system.
Certain fish species were placed under strict seasonal taboo, forbidden to catch or eat during their spawning periods.
Modern marine biologists studying traditional Pacific Island fishery practices have pointed out that these taboos function almost identically to a modern fishery close season, a tool used today specifically to prevent overfishing and allow fish populations to reproduce without pressure. Break a kapu, and the punishment in old Hawaii could be severe, sometimes lethal. That sounds extreme until you consider the alternative. An island community with no taboo system, fishing a reef to collapse, has no fallback food source and nowhere to relocate to. The Kapu system wasn't just spiritual law. It was the only thing standing between a community and a famine with no recovery option. Chapter 7: The Skeptics Chapter: What Scholars Actually Argue. Here's where this video needs to be honest with you, because this is also where a lot of viral content about ancient hidden science goes wrong. Not every historian or anthropologist agrees that health was the primary driver behind these laws. Many argue these rules are better explained group identity, symbolic boundary marking between communities, or theological logic that has nothing to do with hygiene at all. Mary Douglas, one of the most influential anthropologists to study food taboos, argued that systems like kosher law are better understood as a way of organizing the world into categories of order and disorder, not as disguised medical advice. The honest answer is probably both can be true at once. A rule can be motivated by religious and cultural logic and still produce a health benefit as a side effect, reinforced over centuries because communities that happened to follow it survived crises that communities who didn't follow it sometimes didn't. Natural selection doesn't care why a survival behavior exists, only it works. So this isn't a story about ancient priests. It's secretly running microbiology experiments. It's a story about cultural evolution accidentally encoding good outcomes into law. and then preserving those outcomes far longer than any individual generation could have explained them. Chapter 8: Synthesis: How Trial, Error, and Ritual Became Data. Think about what these systems actually had to do without a single microscope, lab, or published study. A community tries something. If it works, fewer deaths, fewer bad harvests, fewer collapsed fisheries, that practice gets repeated. If it doesn't, in the cruelest possible feedback loop, the community that ignored the pattern simply has fewer descendants to pass anything down at all. Over enough centuries, across enough communities, the practices that survived were the ones that worked. Religion didn't invent these rules out of nowhere. That's not primitive thinking. That's a remarkably effective data storage system, built before anyone had the concept of data at all. The forgotten science here isn't a hidden formula. It's the realization that culture itself can function as a slow, brutal, but effective experiment. One that ran for thousands of years before we ever had the tools to understand why it worked. Finally, so the next time someone tells you an old religious food rule is just superstition, it might be worth asking a different question. Not whether it makes sense to us now, but whether it kept the people who followed it alive long enough to ask the question in the first place. If you want more of these, the science hiding inside the things history called superstition, subscribe. There's a lot more forgotten science where this came from.